This is the fifth in a series of 8 lectures on the book of 1 Corinthians. And you will remember in our study of the Old Testament, one of the great chapters in the Bible is Genesis chapter 2. And it was at that time that God had the created man, finished all of his creation, including man, on the 6th day. And then he created Eve from the side of Adam, and he brought the woman to the man, and the man said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And God himself performed the first ceremony there in the Garden of Eden. And this was the first of 3 great institutions given by God to man to help him here on this earth. The institution of the home and marriage in Genesis 2. And of course the Corinthian believers, because they were new in the faith and because most of them had never really studied the Old Testament, and of course much of the New Testament had not been written at the time that Paul wrote to them, knew little about this first of 3 great institutions, that of marriage. And so in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul attempts to answer some of the questions that they had concerning this first institution. There's no doubt about it. It is, admittedly, this chapter, a very difficult one. And however, I think we need to keep in mind several things. And number one, that these chapters 7 through 16, as we have already noted on several occasions, they include only the answers to some of Paul's questions that he had. That is to say, questions that were directed at Paul. And we have the answers here, Paul's answers, but we do not have their questions. And so perhaps if we had some of the questions, then we might understand more of the answers that he gives. And the second thing that we need to keep in mind is that in this chapter, which is a difficult one, Paul indicates that his particular advice is given to govern a particular church at a particular time in history. And some of these verses obviously do not apply to all Christians. Some do, but some do not. For example, verse 7, Paul says, "For I would that all men were even as myself, but every man hath this proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that." So Paul's saying, if I had my way, it'd probably be better if people did not marry and be single as I am, at least at the time that he wrote this. But he does not say that that's the best thing. He simply says, "But every man hath his proper gift." So if Paul was indeed a single man, and if he took the gift and he accepted the ministry of celibacy, that does not mean in any sense of the word that this is the perfect will of God for me. In fact, it would not be God's will for me. So these verses do not necessarily apply across the board to all Christians. And then verse 26, the Apostle Paul says, "I suppose, therefore, that this is good," what he's saying here, "for the present distress." Now, again, we don't know too much about the history of the church in Corinth at that time. It may be, and some would believe, that they were going through a very severe persecution. Now, admittedly, as far as secular history is concerned, we have no record of this, but I'm sure there are many purges and persecutions in church history that we have no record of. And this may have been a local time of severe problems and everything, and Paul may have been writing concerning this at the present time. Also verse 29, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short." And now we don't know what he meant by that phrase, "the time is short." Was he speaking of the rapture time being short? Of course, if that be the case, he was wrong, and we know that Paul could not have been wrong. But did he even have that in mind? Was he perhaps thinking about the time that they had left before the persecution really became such that, maybe they couldn't marry at all? Was that what he was talking about? Well, we just don't know. But we do need to keep this thing in mind, that while the Bible all the Bible was written for our admonition, not all the Bible is directly written telling me what I should do today. Now there's a little song that is written and people sing it, and it's unscriptural. And it goes like this: every promise in the Bible is mine, every chapter, every verse, every line. That is not the case. Paul himself would later say, rightly dividing the Word of God. No 90-year-old grandma would have any scriptural right whatsoever to believe that God would give her a child because He promised Sarah a child when she was 90, and every promise in the Bible is mine, every chapter, every verse, every line. That is not the case. Again, the statement: while all the Bible was written for our admonition, not all the Bible directly applies to me today. If I come down with a serious disease, I have no scriptural right. God may heal me, but I have no scriptural right to expect, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that God will extend my life 15 years, as He did the life of Hezekiah, on the basis that He did it for Hezekiah, and every promise in the Bible is mine, every chapter, every verse, every line. That is not the case here. So some of these verses apply to believers today, and some do not. The principles apply, of course, but not always the language itself. All right, now there are three classes of people addressed in this chapter. It is addressed to those marriages in which both partners are saved, verses 1 to 11. Those marriages in which one partner is unsaved, the other is saved. And then those unmarried individuals. Now notice the first 11 verses, those marriages in which both partners are saved. Paul says both partners, man and wife, are to render due benevolence to each other. This phrase is translated goodwill in Ephesians 6, verse 7. My wife is not only to be my wife and my companion, but she's to be my friend, and I'm to be her friend. We are to render due benevolence one to the other. And then neither partner, man or wife, is to defraud the other. Now, the context here shows this is to be in regards to sexual rights. Actually, we speak of fasting, and we sometimes limit this word fasting to that of food, the absence of food. But in the Bible, in the New Testament, there are three kinds of fasting. Fasting by avoiding food, fasting by avoiding sleep, fasting by avoiding sex. On occasion, God well may call a man and his wife to fast in matters of all three. If they have a special decision they want to make, or they feel they just want to draw closer to God, they may determine for a while to do without food, to do without sex, and to do without sleep, perhaps to stay up and read the Word of God and pray, or get up early and meet God. But no partner has the right to withhold his or her body from the attention and the interest and the comfort of his or her spouse. And so Paul brings that to our attention, and we surely need to keep this in mind today. The women's liberation movement, and we seem to have the idea that what is mine, and simply because I'm married, this does not mean that you have any more hold over me than you did before we were married. Now you see, that's the philosophy of the world today, and here you have two movie stars marrying, and they have their careers, and they have their separate salaries, and many of the women won't even take the last name of their husband. And you see, that's the one extreme. Of course, the other extreme is to be so domineering and to demand that my spouse do this or do that. And, well, that's the other extreme. But Paul here stresses that if the husband and the wife in the Lord render due benevolence one to the other, then indeed their marriage will be a successful one. And the golden rule certainly does not save anybody, but I'll tell you one thing, it certainly keeps a lot of marriages saved. If I would do unto my wife as I would have my wife do unto me. All right. So here he speaks now concerning those principles which should govern married people, and if both are saved. And then verses 12 to 24, he speaks of those marriages in which one partner unsaved. And here he says that if at all possible, the believer should remain with the unbeliever. Of course, he or she should not marry an unbeliever, but if they do, they still ought to remain together. And often, though, what happens is this. Here are two unbelievers and they get married and one gets saved. Usually it's the woman, but many times it's the man. And so you have a saved husband and an unsaved wife, or an unsaved husband and a saved wife. And right away there's sort of the eternal triangle, because now God is involved in the picture, and the one spouse is jealous of God because God has now taken the attention that once belonged to them from their partner. But Paul says to be as loving and cheerful as possible, and he makes a statement here. He says that in verse 14, he says, the unbelieving partner, he said, is sanctified by the believing partner. Now, our certain group of Christians believe that the word sanctification means to be made holy. And they say believers are to be made holy when they're sanctified, the second work of grace. That isn't the meaning of the word at all. It does have the root word, holiness, but simply speaking, the theological definition of the word sanctification is separation. And it means here that the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the believing wife. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Spirit of God has a far better chance to get in and to separate unto himself, as far as conviction and everything, to really set this unsaved partner up, to knock him off for Christ, as it were, if he has a believing wife on his side. It is much easier, if things are as they should be, for an unbelieving husband to get saved if he has a believing wife, or for an unbelieving wife to accept Christ if she has, she has a saved husband praying for her. And so that's the statement here, and that's why believers are to stay married, if at all possible, to unbelievers. Not only that, but because, not that it might get saved, which is a good reason, but also because the very institution of marriage is ordained by God. Now, sometimes students don't understand this, and they come to the college or institute or seminary here at Thomas Road, and God has called them to be a minister. Well, that's fine. We rejoice in that. And then, though I look at their application, and I notice that they've suffered the heartbreak of divorce, and they're happily remarried now, but they were divorced, and I asked him about that. Oh, well, he said, that's all under the blood. And that happened before I was saved. Well, that makes no difference. You see, God did not give the institution of marriage to save people any more than He gave the institution of human government to save people. He gave the institution of marriage and the institution of human government, He gave it to men and to women, saved or unsaved. And it's just as bad and just as harmful. I think it grieves God about as much if a home is broken up in communist China, where both man and wife are unsaved, as it is in America when a Christian home is broken up. Maybe not quite as much, but married, the institution of marriage is as binding upon the unsaved communist family as it is upon the saved American family. So the institution of marriage was given not to Christians. They certainly ought to bring it to its fulfillment, to display the love that Christ had for the church. But it was given to men and to women, to mankind. And so for that reason, it doesn't make any difference whether both people are saved or not. The husband has no right to say, well, I can leave my wife now because I got saved and she's not saved, and besides that, we were married. before we were saved, and that means we're really not married at all now. It certainly does not mean that. All right, so you have the second of three groups now, those marriages in which both partners are saved, those marriages in which one partner is unsaved, and then those unmarried individuals, those unclaimed blessings. Verses 25 to 40. Paul says, there are times when it may be best to remain unmarried for a while. Now again, even though sometimes the language may seem to indicate this, by comparing what Paul wrote in other passages with this here, he does not teach that it is always better for a Christian to remain unmarried. He simply does not say that, because later on, to say one of the qualifications for a pastor is he be the husband of one wife, and Paul would not make that statement. But there are times, verses 32, 33, 34, when an individual can do more for Christ single than if married. There's no doubt about it that Paul would not have, humanly speaking, been able to do the work that Christ called him to do in the same fashion, that is to say, with the same freedom, if he were married. But with the same token, as far as we know, Simon Peter's wife, we don't read about her very much. In fact, we don't read about her at all, actually, by name. There's no doubt she was married. He was married to a woman, and so he had a family, may have had children, we don't know. But he became the spokesman for the apostles, and later on, of course, he would write 1st and 2nd Peter, be the great preacher at Pentecost, and really be the head honcho, not the Pope, but the head honcho for the Church of Jerusalem for a number of years. So he did as much for Jesus in his own area, being married as the Apostle Paul did, being unmarried, but they had different ministries. All right, and then thirdly, this area here concerning unmarried people, at all times, a believer should seek God's perfect will concerning whether to marry or to remain single. And I think the bottom line, and a lot of times people forget this, is what Paul's saying in chapter 7 about the subject of marriage, is found in verses 23 and 24. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man in whatsoever state he is called there abide with God. So I think a young person has to decide early in life, is it the will of God for me to marry? If it is, the man sins or the woman sins by not getting married. If it is not the will of God, the man or woman sins by getting married, regardless of who they marry. So it boils down to this: what is the will of God for my life? And only you can answer that by waiting upon the Lord and listening as He reveals His will to you. All right, now of the questions that Paul is asked, this is the first one. And I told you there were 6 questions from chapter 7 to 16 that the church wanted to know. And they learned that Chloe was going to leave Corinth, and he was going to make a business trip to the city of Ephesus where Paul was. And they said, well, Chloe, you ask Paul about these questions after you tell him about all our faults and everything. And then you ask him these questions. So the first question, what about marriage? Paul answers that in 1 Corinthians 7. And then the second question, what about Christian liberty? And they had a real problem there. And Paul discusses this in chapters 8 through 10. And then what about church conduct? How should the believer behave himself in the house of God? He answers that in chapter 11. And then what about spiritual gifts? He answers that in 12, 13, and 14. What about the resurrection? This is answered in chapter 15. Then the sixth question, what about the offering, collection, tithing, and my financial responsibilities to God? And that's answered in chapter 16. All right, now our second question, what about Christian liberty? Now, as a child of God, this is probably, by the way, one of the most relevant issues that Paul discusses as far as we're concerned today of anything else in the book of 1 Corinthians, with the possible exception of what he says about tongues in 1 Corinthians 14. But to believers, this is an extremely important issue today, Because as a child of God, I have been liberated, according to the book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 4, Christ has redeemed me. He's the end of the law, etc. So I've been liberated from the law of sin, the law of death. Now, does this imply that I can now do any lawful thing I desire? Now notice, it's the word lawful. Paul doesn't discuss any bad things here. That doesn't mean that a Christian can even entertain the thought, well, now can I go out and commit adultery because I'm not under the law, and the seventh commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery, and therefore that means if I'm not under it, I can commit it. Only a fool would even ask something like that, because the Scripture says that Christ has kept the law for us, but we are responsible for the principles in the law, not to the law itself, but to Christ. And if the believer commits adultery, he's going to answer not to the law and taken out and stoned, as Moses would have him done, but he's going to answer to Jesus. So Christ has kept the law for us, but if we belong to Jesus, then He wants to give us the strength to keep the precepts of the law, not to get saved, but because we are saved. So it's not a question here, can I do any crazy thing I want to do, whether it's right or not? But the question is, and it's a very real, it's a burning issue, can I do any lawful thing I desire? Well, Paul answers this question by citing three examples. First of all, he gives them a current example, which is a problem they had in the church at Corinth at the time. And then he points to himself. He gives them a personal example about certain things he could do that were lawful, but he wasn't doing. And then he gives them an Old Testament example about what happened when Israel did those things that maybe in themselves were lawful, but by doing that they got out of the will of God and they missed God's best for their nation and for their lives as individuals. Now, what about this question concerning Christian liberty? He gives a current example, the Corinthian believers, and they had a burning issue there that would seem rather silly today, but I suppose they would have looked with some wonder upon the things that we're concerned about today. And here was their issue. In those days, there were many pagan temples at Corinth. Somebody has estimated, I think there may have been as many as 1,000 in the city of Corinth alone. And these pagan temples given over to the Baalite and the Canaanite gods and everything, the Roman, the Greek gods, received sacrifices just as they sacrificed animals in the temple. So here you have tons and tons of fresh meat that were sacrificed to these idols. Well, the priest would eat a lot of it, the food and everything, but they would take the carcass in payment of, forgiving the person who gave it for their sins. But they had a lot of spare beef and pork and everything, and so what they would do is doubtless sell this. They probably had their own shops, and they'd sell it in the marketplace there, and they could afford to sell it cheaper because of its previous usage. In other words, they probably got it free for, during their mumbo-jumbo, so they weren't out a lot. And so when they were filled, their bellies were filled with the food, they could sell the rest. And so they could probably sell it cheaper than what the regular shop where they had to buy from the farmer, and he hadn't made his profit. And so they, could buy it, sell it cheaper at these idol butcher markets as they could at the regular butcher market. So here is Miss Thrifty housewife, a Christian in the church at Corinth. She comes along and she sees that beefsteak in this one store is, we'll make some ridiculous price here. Back then, probably wouldn't nearly be as much then as it was today. Let's say it's $1 a pound. That would be great, wouldn't it? Well, in those days, that'd be pretty high. And so she's not sure. Well, it's pretty high. So she goes across the street and she sees another butcher shop, and there it's for sale for 75 cents a pound. Well, it's the same kind of meat. So if she's a thrifty housewife, she may buy the 75-cent pound steak as opposed to the $1 pound. And maybe after the services, they have some people over and they serve them steak, and they're eating and having fellowship and talking about the sermon. And one housewife said, you always seem to really put out a wonderful meal here. How do you, your husband makes about the same as my husband, how do you account for the fact that you can You can really make the dollar stretch. And she said, oh, well, as far as the steak that we ate tonight, I found a little butcher shop, a tiny little place, and they got some real bargains. Whoa, where's that? And she gives her the address. Oh, wait a minute. Don't you know that's an idol butcher shop? You mean you brought food there? Well, yeah, that's true. It's an idol butcher shop. Hey, but wait a minute. Look, we know that there's no such thing as an idol. I mean, there's no real God, but Jehovah God. And so it's clean. And it doesn't make any difference. If we can buy it cheaper, then we can put the extra quarter in the on the offering. There was a controversy there, and you had those who said you could eat meat offered to an idol and not grieve the Spirit of God, and there are those that said, "Oh no, that's a terrible sin." Well, they wrote to Paul about that, and notice what Paul's answer is. Paul, first of all, said, "Hey, look, we're talking about a neutral situation. In itself, this is neither white or black, it's gray, and it can go either way." He said, "Meat commendeth us not to God. For neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse." Now I have an idea, I don't know, but I have an idea that Paul was pretty thrifty, I'm sure of that, and if the truth were known, he probably was buying some of that meat himself. Because he's not going to waste that extra quarter. But here is the conclusion he makes. After he shows them that there are some sins that are sin, not because they are wrong in themselves, but because of the reputation that they have gathered. "Wherefore, if meat maketh my brother to offend, I will eat no meat or no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend." And so he admonishes believers. He said, look, keep in mind that, he said, you are responsible to at least 5 classes of people. You're responsible to the world in general. "Let your light so shine before men that others may see your good work and glorify your Father which is in heaven." So I'm responsible to my unsaved neighbors, my conduct of life. I'm responsible to my immediate family. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, be in subjection to your husband. Children, obey your parents. Parents, provoke not your children to wrath. We are responsible to our families. We are responsible to all believers in general. We are responsible to weaker believers in particular. And we are responsible to the local church. So the next time you are asked the question, or you're tempted to ask the question, is it wrong to do thus and such? Now, first of all, you have to ask, does the Bible prohibit this? So don't ever ask a young person, if you're listening to the tape, don't ever ask your pastor, is it wrong to smoke? If you don't believe the Bible, then believe the Surgeon General of the United States, because he has determined that it is wrong for you to smoke, because your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and he's put it on every pack of cigarettes. Warning, the Surgeon General of the United States has determined that this pack of cigarettes is harmful to your health. It used to say may harm, but now they've changed it. It's stronger. Is harmful to your health. So don't ever ask that. But, well, is it wrong to do maybe certain neutral things? And you have to, whatever it is, ask yourself the question. Number one, is it prohibited in the Bible? Secondly, will it harm my testimony? And if it is, if it will harm your testimony, if people will misunderstand, then it's wrong. Let me give an example. I love war stories. I've read everything I could ever find on Adolf Hitler and World War II, and probably 50 to 60 books on the history of World War II, and especially documentary films on World War II. I just eat them up, and every time one's on television, I watch it. And I'd watch more if I had the time. The Battle of the Bulge and The Longest Day, and etc. I love watching those, in spite of maybe a few language words in there that I don't approve of. I would never, though, feel right going to a movie and watching one. Well, what's the difference? Willmington, you don't attend a movie and watch one, and yet you'll watch it in your home on television. What's the difference? All the difference in the world. A matter of testimony. You see, the world, at least the fundamentalist world in which I walk and have my lifestyle in, they assume that a teacher would not, the Bible Institute would not attend a movie. And you see, that would be a bad testimony for my students. We say they can't, and what happened if I would, you see. So for personal testimony, I will watch a documentation on World War II on television. I will not see it in a movie house. And we need to keep this in mind concerning Christian liberty. And Paul says that we are not to allow our liberty to become a stumbling block for sometimes weaker Christians. Now, let me give you another example that is not in your notes. And we have the question here, how, though, can one decide upon that which is right or wrong? The Bible declares an action may be wrong on two counts. Number one, because of an inherent sin factor. I'm sort of just summarizing what I've already said here. There are certain things that always are wrong because they go against the very grain of God's holiness. For example, such things would include murder, lying, adultery, stealing, idolatry. They're always wrong regardless of when they're done. Now, there are some things, though, that are not wrong in themselves. They have no inherent sin factor, but they do have an acquired sin factor. They're harmless in themselves, but through time and custom have acquired the taint of being evil. As an example of this would be the wearing of cosmetics. You see, this would once be considered sinful, but now, if modestly applied, is generally accepted among Christian women. My wife wears a little makeup, and frankly, she weighs around 100 pounds, and I think I call her my 100 pounds of vanilla, and I don't think it hurts to have a little strawberry topping on that vanilla. So she wears a little lipstick, and I don't know whether she wears rouge or not. I suppose she does, a little eyeshadow, and I think she looks very pretty, and I hope as you see her on television that you think she does too. But at any rate, a number of years ago, it would have been wrong for my wife, I believe, to wear any makeup, especially in certain areas, because many years ago, especially at the turn of the century, only harlots wore makeup. Of course, that's not true today. And in fact, in some big cities, you'll find that the harlots, one of the mark of the harlot, they do not wear any makeup at all, you see. And that's sort of, they instead of overpainting themselves like they used to, they don't wear any. And so a woman needs to keep this in mind. Is this harmful to my testimony? Obviously, there's nothing immoral about some pancake makeup on a woman. That's a neutral issue. But we have to determine whether this will hurt our testimony. As far as I know, the wearing of modest makeup does not, in any area today that I know of, any major area where a Christian might find himself, harm her testimony. So, as a result, then most Christian women wear modest makeup. Okay, now, this first factors we have in our note. I was going to give an example. A few years ago we had David Dillinger and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and some of these hippies and yippies burning down buildings, and their mark of anarchy and rebellion was wearing beards and mustaches. And so a few years ago then Christian schools determined that it would be best for testimony's sake their students not to have beards or mustaches. And so there are a lot of Archie Bunkers running around in America, and they still look upon a long bearded individual as a hippie, even though obviously many young people who wear beards are far from being hippies. But see, they haven't adjusted to that yet, and they still look upon that as something bad, and that's the last thing the Christian wants to depict, as he doesn't want to be associated with that movement. One of our fine, outstanding black students, this man's going to be an evangelist for the Lord, and he's a close friend of mine, and he shaved his mustache, and he had a very, very modest mustache. I thought he looked good with it, and so he looked different without it, and I talked to him about it, and he said, I've got a problem, Dean Willmington. I said, what is that? He said, well, in the black community, he said, all the men wear mustaches. And he said, I shave mine off, and I want to do what God wants me to do. But I said, well, what's the problem? The problem is, he said, in the black community, he said, many of the gay blacks advertise their homosexuality, not all of them, but many of them do, by the shaving of their mustache. And he said, what should I do? I said, you should get permission right away to grow that and grow it right back immediately. And he did. We understood. Now, I think it would be wrong for us not to allow him, in fact, not to insist, perhaps, that he grow a mustache, because he does not want to be associated, nor do we want him to be associated, you see, with the homosexual black movement, as it were. So again, it's not the growing of a mustache or the shaving of a mustache, but this is a reputation sin, and it has an acquired sin factor, and we have to determine what that is all about. All right, now, so Paul then gives the example in order to illustrate what he's saying by using a current example from the eating of meat situation, and then a personal example in verses 1:27, chapter 9. In these verses, Paul points out that no one had more right to exercise his Christian liberty as did the Apostle Paul. He said he was an apostle, he had seen Christ, he had founded their own church there in Corinth, and he said he had a right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, he had the right to marry and enjoy a family life, he had a right to expect those churches he founded, including the Church of Corinth, to support him financially. But Paul refused to exercise those rights. He did not eat anything he wanted, any lawful thing I mean now. He did not lead his wife around or did not determine to get married, if he indeed had been married. And he refused to accept or to demand support from the Church at Corinth. He took it from the Church at Philippi and others, but you see, the Church at Corinth was a real fickle church, and he knew that if he took money from them, they would say, the guy's just in it for the money. Boy, he's really living in it, probably driving a Cadillac, you see. So he said, I robbed other churches. In other words, I accepted more than I should from other churches, rather than accept from you. He said, lest, in chapter 9, in verse 18, he said, I did this so that I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. All right, he says that he will set aside a number of his God-given rights, because he felt more responsible toward the feelings and the testimony of the people that he ministered to than he did in exercising the rights that he could have exercised. And the bottom line, of course, is this, in chapter 9, verses 19 and 22. He said, I do this that I might gain the more. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So Paul was a living testimony of these statements. And thus, in ministering to the Jews, Paul did certain things and did not do certain things in order not to offend them unnecessarily. And by the way, the gospel is offensive the way it is. You tell an unsaved man he's going to a devil's hell unless he repents. He's a sinner. He's helpless before God. He's as bad off as he can possibly be spiritually. And that's pretty offensive. So we do not need to make ourselves more offensive than what the gospel is already. And Paul made sure that he used tact and did certain things that would not offend people. For example, he circumcises Timothy in Lystra, because Timothy had, even though circumcision had officially been set aside as far as the Gentiles were concerned, and really the Jews didn't need this anymore either as a religious rite, R-I-T-E, a ceremony. But in order not to offend the Jews, he went ahead and circumcised Timothy, because Timothy had a Gentile father, but he had a Jewish mother. Now later on, though, he would refuse to circumcise another young pastor by the name of Titus, because Titus was not a Jew. So he became all things to all men. Now, I should say all lawful things to all men. That does not mean that you become a drunkard in order to reach drunkards, but it does mean that you go out of your way to avoid becoming a bad testimony to any person that you're attempting to reach. And that, by the way, it means that also that a pastor, I think, has to be very careful concerning the car that he drives. Now, I'm not saying it's sin to drive a certain model of car, but I do know this, that recently I just purchased a car, and it's not an extremely expensive one, but I looked at two models, and I won't tell you what they are because maybe some pastors listening or some of you are driving these models, but there are two among the many that have a reputation of being driven by rich people. Oh, well, he drives a you-know-what, or he drives this other kind. That means he's got a lot of money. Well, it might not mean that at all. It just means he got a lot of credit, you see. The fellow said, yeah, that's a company car over there. He said, oh, is that right? He said, yeah, a finance company. But at any rate, it does mean that it meant that I had to stop and really think and ask my wife about it. I said, I could drive this car, honey, and I've got a real good buy on it. It's a used one. It's a demonstrator, has a few thousand miles. And she said, well, probably wouldn't cost you much more than another new car, but she said, what would your students think, if they knew that you were driving this particular model? And I really had to stop and think and ask myself, well, what would they think? And so as a result, I just didn't feel that I could go ahead, and even though financially it wasn't that much more. We have to avoid all appearance of evil. We just have 2 minutes here, and I've got a lot more I need to say, but I suppose Paul says it all here in chapter 9, verse 27 about Christian liberty. He says, I keep under my body and bring it unto subjection. I watch what I do, Paul said. I watch where I go and even what I eat. Why? Lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway. Literally, I should become disapproved. And the child of God can get himself out of the will of God, not by doing any biblical sin, but by doing those things that are questionable, neutral in themselves, but questionable in the eyes of weaker believers, the eyes of a local church, or in the eyes of the world, to the extent where God has to set him or her aside and cannot use that believer in the perfect way that God wanted to use them. And I think that's tragic. Some believers have taken that step. All right, and they have become castaways, that is to say, they have been set on the shelf by God. We're going to continue this subject of Christian liberty during the next lecture.